Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the 11th Strand Group meeting, the signature seminar series of the Policy Institute at King's College London. I am John Davis. It's my very great pleasure to offer you all a real treat this evening, the inaugural lecture of Lord Willetts. We also have a fabulous respondent, Sir Venkatraman Ramakrishnan, President of the Royal Society. So without further ado, and as always, tonight's event is supported by our great friends at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. With 100 years of science policy, please welcome Lord Willetts.
Well, thank you very much indeed for coming along this evening. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me as a visiting professor here at King's to be finally delivering my inaugural lecture. And it's good of you to come along. It has such a boring title. I just hope that by the end of this evening it doesn't feel like you have been through the whole 100 years. But although it's about 100 years, with the, as we are honoured with the President of the Royal Society joining us, I thought I should say, for Venki's benefit, that before the 100 years I'm going to cover, there was a previous 250 years, going back to the founding of the Royal Society, and that moment when it recognised that instead of the medieval model of a private, secretive club exchanging mysteries and secrets, they should instead engage in science as an open enterprise and publish their transactions and put them open to peer review, was a crucial step in the history of scientific discovery, not just in Britain, but across the Western world. And it's very important for my thesis, actually, because our network of learned societies, our free press, our clubs, our coffee clubs, the Lunar Society in Birmingham, where I came from, was the intellectual backdrop for the scientific and technological advances of the Industrial Revolution. They didn't happen in Britain in our universities. They happened in that network. And there are two different models. I'm very briefly going to offer you two accounts of them as to where you do your research. This is the famous proposal, and this is a quotation from Humboldt, who wrote what has been called the greatest education and science white paper ever. And after Prussia had been defeated and humiliated by Napoleon and was trying to reconstruct itself, it was Humboldt who sent in a paper proposing that they should focus on research and development, and their universities should be the place for research and development, not academies. Crucial argument that the university was the place to do it. It is noticeable when you read through his paper that the argument is that doing some teaching helps to stimulate your research activity. He doesn't claim that doing the research activity in any way improves your teaching, though that remains a controversial issue. That's the Humboldt model. Separately, for us in Britain, we had, hang on, here we go. Here we are. We had the classic statement from Cardinal Newman in his Idea of a University, published in 1854, which is exactly the opposite of the Humboldt model, that a university is a place of teaching. He calls it universal knowledge, which incidentally is an etymological error. The universitas of university does not mean universal in that sense. It means independent, self-subsisting, not dependent on anything else. But nevertheless, his doctrine, based on his experience at Oxford, was that universities were for teaching, and as he says, if its object was scientific and philosophical discovery, I do not see why a university should have students. And it is just possible there are research professors today who still privately share that thought. And as a result, through the 19th century, Germany's formidable research effort was led by its universities, whereas in Britain, even after the great reforms of Oxford and Cambridge in the 1850s, one German said to Thomas Arnold that the new reformed Oxford was, and I quote, an excellent gymnasium, by which he meant it did good teaching, but of course it didn't do research. And when George Eliot's Casaubon finally abandons his great project of understanding and summarizing all the world's symbols, it's because he cannot speak German and is therefore incapable of keeping up with so much of modern learning. So in the 19th century, the German research university led the world, and Britain's universities focused very much on teaching. The crucial moment, and this is a familiar story, the crucial experience was the First World War. And here is the kind of picture of us v Germany that we've become very familiar with. A government report in July 1915 recognizing that because Germany had applied science, we had had many of our industries unable to produce the full range of goods. And going on, a significant, and first time I found this in a government policy document in the UK, to say a great part of all research will necessarily be done in universities and colleges which are already aided by the state. And that statement, recognition during the First World War that Britain required a more systematic research effort, which should be university-based, led to the event led in 1916 to the creation of a department of scientific and industrial research, but also led to a wider change in the role of universities. 1916, America was still neutral. Why? There was a battle for influence in America going on between the UK and Germany. In many ways, UK's links to the US you might regard as being far more significant than Germany's links to the US. But there was one really important exception. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century and the early 20th century, American academics who wanted to conduct research or get postgraduate qualifications, or write doctorates, which were necessary for promotion in the US, were going to German universities. There were no British universities that they could attend to study this, because Britain only did undergraduate study. And there was in 1916, what I, as a former politician, recognise as one of those media storms. An academic came back from the US and wrote this in The Observer, an article which prompted a very lively argument that got into Parliament and elsewhere. And he was basically factually correct. Harvard, the president of Harvard studied in Germany. Half of his staff studied in Germany. Where did American academics go to get their postgraduate qualifications? They went to Germany. It was factually correct. And suddenly, this started to matter. And for the first time, it attracted the interest of Whitehall. And as you would expect, the department that was most concerned was the Foreign Office. So there was, the Foreign Office got involved. What could Britain do to match Germany's influence? It manifestly needed to start offering educational and research qualifications of the sort which Americans were able to get in Germany. So the Foreign Office got involved, and Balfour, the Foreign Secretary, helped persuade Oxford to create a doctorate program. Oxford was first. The first doctorate in English universities in Oxford launched in 1917. And then he discovered if we wanted to engage, if Americans were to understand what was on offer for them in the UK, you needed some kind of systematic arrangement so they could communicate with British universities as a group. There was no group. So he, and this is done so delicately, he's trying to respect the autonomy of universities. As he says, I am venturing now to invite representatives of all the universities of Great Britain and Ireland to meet Mr. Fisher, who's the Education Secretary, and myself at the Foreign Office. Now it's 1980. So America has entered the war. There's hope of defeating Germany, but the issue remains. It now becomes, well, after the war, we don't want the Americans all to revert to going to Germany. We still need to do something. And he convened this meeting, and at the meeting, he basically asked British universities to form some kind of collective group, some kind of shared group, which would enable the British postgraduate offer to be explained properly to the Americans, give the Americans a group to deal with, so that they could attract more Americans. And one of the vice-chancellors at the meeting, the vice-chancellor of Birmingham University, very astutely said, all right, you want Foreign Secretary to attract lots of Americans to Britain to do postgraduate qualifications. That's fine. But when they come here, they may be rather shocked with the quality of the facilities that they find. So, of course, Foreign Secretary, it's very important we do this, but it would be so helpful if there could be perhaps some public funding to enable us to provide Americans with the kind of facilities that they would be entitled to expect. And so, if you put together all these events, you find there was a crucial period, and we are at its 100th anniversary at the moment, in which a series of features which we are all familiar with in the British higher education landscape was constructed in a period of 3 years. The first department funding and promoting organised research from Whitehall, the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, created in 1916. The first doctoral programme introduced in 1917 and by 1920 widespread across Britain's universities. In response to Balfour's invitation to the Foreign Office, the Committee of Vice-Chancellors and Principals was created, now UUK. The Haldane report came out on the structure of government, and I'll comment on that later on. And the University Grants Committee, the predecessor of HEFCE, was created in order to provide the money that would ensure that the Americans would come over and like what they saw of British education. In 3 years, most of what we are now familiar with as the key elements of the structure of British higher education and research were created. And it was driven by the Foreign Office, and it was driven by, finally, a recognition of the competitive challenge between us and Germany. The UGC, of course, not distinguishing between funding research and teaching, providing block grants. Haldane first formulating, John Davis and I were talking about this earlier on today, first formulating the principle that kind of form should follow function and identifying a need for research across Whitehall and proposing that it should be done in two ways. The Department of Scientific and Industrial Research should be the department promoting general research, but in addition, individual Whitehall departments that required applied research for their own purposes should have budgets to purchase their own immediate research. And that structure, and I am simplifying a bit because I'm not going to take you through large amounts of history, but that structure, a lot of it survived. A lot of it survives to this day. Certainly a lot of it functioned throughout the Second World War. The Second World War was less disruptive of this structure. The First World War was a crucial series of events which shape it. And certainly it survived pretty much in that form into the 1960s, with the DSIR, the crucial body, funding a lot of research. But by the 1960s, so let's now move on 50 years, by the 1960s, this was the time when the leader of the opposition was running for Harold Wilson, heading towards the 1964 election, with arguing for the white heat of the technological revolution, a sense that Britain was falling behind and was not being sufficiently competitive, and that we needed to raise our game and R&D. And the next burst of activity, which shapes structures which we're familiar with today, comes in the mid-60s. It begins with a report from Burke Trend, the Cabinet Secretary, who essentially proposed the abolition of the DSIR, which had been a single Whitehall department funding lots of different research activities, and he proposed instead the creation of a series of research councils. There had been one before the MRC with a distinguished history going right back to even just before the First World War. He thought that there should be a structure of research councils. He initially proposed 3, but it ended up rather more than that. There should be a minister with clear overall responsibility for them, because the DSIR had been under a cabinet committee structure. And the idea had been that the Lord Privy Seal or another senior cabinet minister should take an overview. The radical suggestion in 1963 was that instead of having a cabinet committee coordinating, there should be a specific identifiable minister for science with responsibility. And to ensure there was coordination between these different research councils, there should be an advisory council advising on cross-research council issues. And that was what he proposed, and we pretty much have still what one would recognise as the modern research council model, the Howard Wilson. Now the Haldane principle, which is, and it's great to see Graham Reed here in the audience, who was one of my key officials in science policy when I was the minister, and I can still remember he was coming into my office and explaining to me very early on I had to sign up to the Haldane principle or else all kind of problems would emerge. Here you are, Minister, this is an excellent statement of a principle you'll be happy to subscribe to. The Haldane principle, you won't find it, which nowadays we think you don't get involved in the detail, the micro decisions about science, allocation of science resources or specific science project. You can't really find it in Haldane. And there is a suitably revisionist view from David Edgerton, now at King's, that really the modern form of the Haldane principle can be traced back to political arguments around the 1964 budget, 1964 election, sorry, when Harold Wilson's arguments that government should do far more to promote science and technology was challenged by Quentin Hailsham, claiming that this would be government interference in the independence of science and was a threat to what he called the Haldane principle. So essentially, David claims that the Haldane principle is a political invention of Quentin Hogg, but you can just about trace its roots back before, but certainly in its modern form, it dates to the 1964 election campaign. And I would, in this kind of canonical tradition of serious science ministers, I have to say those two of my heroes, William Waldegrave in the 1990s, improving and extending the structure to the research councils that we're now familiar with, and David Sainsbury engaging in further significant reforms and ensuring that the full cost of research, not just the marginal cost, was to be funded. So there, I have taken you through an incredibly quick tour of basically how we got to something like the current structure. But these arrangements are obviously always contested and always debated. And in the second half of my talk, I just want to focus on the tensions, three trade-offs that help one understand the policy dilemmas that I wrestled with as science minister and my successors wrestle with today. The first one, and each one of these I'll devote a bit more time to. The first of all is, okay, you've got a science budget for general scientific research. You want departments to do their own, commission their own R&D. What's the balance between those, and how do departments deliver their commitments to their R&D? That's the first tension, balance between science budget and departmental R&D. Secondly, we have a rather unusual structure. This is what's called the dual funding structure, in which we both have money going into research through university grants, because we saw going right back to the creation of the UGC, grants that cover both teaching and research. And there's a separate strand of funding going through the research councils, quite a lot of which they themselves spend in universities. Is that dual funding model, which is quite unusual. What's the logic of that? And then there's thirdly, this research that we're funding, where should it happen? Should it happen on universities? To what extent should it happen in research institutes not located on university campuses? And those three tensions, which are a kind of, the first one is kind of autonomous, Haldane principle protected research versus directed departmental R&D. The second one is the dual funding stream, where do you fund universities through, do you fund research through institutions like universities, or do you fund it through programs run by research councils? And the third one is, where should this happen, in universities or in non-university setting? And each of those I will turn to. So let's start with science, the science budget protected by the Haldane principle as against departmental R&D. And one of the most vividly written, lucid reports on this came from Victor Rothschild in 1971, who argued that there should be, in his words, applied R&D must have a customer. He wanted a customer contractor model in which departments would purchase relevant R&D research themselves using their own departmental research budgets, whereas basic, fundamental or pure research, called basic research, was the responsibilities of the science budget. And that, and he goes on, it's an endless issue, how do you coordinate it? There should be the Council of Scientific Policy to advise Secretary of State about the distribution of funds. Now, the Rothschild, that was a bold set of proposals from Rothschild. It encountered two problems, a kind of high-minded problem and a rather more practical, low-minded problem. The high-minded problem was that nowadays we would be skeptical, I think, after great insights like Donald Stokes and Pasteur's quadrant. We'd be rather skeptical about the idea you can have a group of people just purchasing immediate R&D without any knowledge or awareness of where the wider research agenda is heading, and people doing the wider research detached from particular applications. It's often the interaction of bold theoretical advances and practical needs. It's precisely the interaction of those which may itself be highly creative. So he draws a distinction very starkly that a lot of my friends in the science community no longer believe could be so stark. And of course, a vivid example, if you're in Pasteur's quadrant, as it's called, you are engaged in fundamental, pure research, but it clearly has enormous practical application. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is one which is relevant to this day, which was that in order to deliver his structure, there was a 25% cut in research council budgets to allocate these budgets to individual departments to spend in R&D. And when I arrived in Whitehall as Minister for Science, 40 years later, at least one chief executive of a research council took me aside and said, when are we going to get our money back from the department that was supposed to be spending it on R&D and doesn't? So there is deep distrust in the scientific research community where the departments can be entrusted with R&D budgets. It's a great idea in theory. Does it work in practice? And indeed, it was something that I discussed with John Beddington, then the chief scientist, during the summer 2010 CSR. The risk that, like kind of worse sort of short-term British business, departments under enormous financial pressures, well, one of the things we can cut is the research budget. And John and I sent round a letter to spending departmental ministers saying, please would they let us know, and we very much hope that despite all the enormous pressures they are under, they'll be able to protect their R&D budgets. But it was like a sort of a polite cough on the fringes of a brutal fist fight going on between individual departments and the Treasury. I'm not sure that letter actually had much impact, and we see right through to this day the same issue. Where is the departmental R&D that is supposed to operate in parallel with the Haldane protected science budget? And incidentally, just in case this rings any bells for people engaged in current policy issues, they did, of course, have a discussion as to whether you needed to strengthen the power of coordination. And after very careful consideration of the proposals from this distinguished gentleman, they decided, after several months of reflection and consulting the scientific community, that it would not be correct to interpose any executive statutory body between the Secretary of State and the research councils. So there was that was Rothschild. One of the arguments has been, but if you don't have a statutory body, you don't have someone presiding over the research councils, nothing ever changes. You can't rebalance funding. And Ashley Sweetman, who is here as a researcher in the policy unit, here in the Policy Institute here at King's, has kindly assembled this data. I asked him, could you try to track the budgets of individual research councils to see if there is any variation? And you can see that there is some. I don't claim it's massive, but you can see that it's not the case it's completely fixed. And I myself, again, I remember, because it is a legitimate decision of the science minister, I remember being presented with the decision whether I wished to change the balance of funding between different research councils. And my view was that with a flat cash settlement, better than we had feared, but still tight, with a flat cash settlement, it simply was not worth having an argument to take 50 million of cash or something from one research council and plonking it with another research council. I didn't think that that was an argument worth having. And moreover, more deeply, when you look at those Elsevier cobwebs of strength in research, quality of research, where they do these field-weighted citation indices. They take roughly, they work out an average kind of baseline rate of citations you would expect given the discipline. And then they look for individual countries, how their rate of citation compares with the baseline. Britain is distinctive in that all of our different disciplines score similarly high performance relative to baseline. So if you look at the distribution of UK research, you wouldn't say they're amazingly good at physics but hopeless at life sciences, or good on the art side but the social sciences are weak. What you'd find is, and it is an amazing achievement for a medium-sized country, what you'd find is excellence pretty well distributed. And my view is that given that connectivity, making connections between different disciplines is so fundamental, I would not, one of my nightmare scenarios, which fortunately I didn't have to confront, and I hope it never faces one of my successors, is if money ever got so tight that you did have to take a fundamental decision like we're going to have to focus on life sciences, or we're going to have to focus on the physical sciences, we can't afford what we're doing on the life sciences as well. I think it would be very difficult to do that kind of thing. And if one were trying to shift priorities, I think it would have to be a result of a very open and explicit consultation with outside experts. It would be hard just to do it as a Whitehall decision. So that's the kind of first set of issues of focusing on the balance between the science budget and departmental R&D. And what the endless reductions in departmental R&D budgets has done is that what you keep on finding as the science minister is you've got this science budget which is always seen as going to be half of the total of what government did. And meanwhile, the DFE or the DWP would be busy commissioning research on social mobility, and DEFRA would be busy driving agricultural research to find out about diseases affecting British crops or whatever, and the Foreign Office would be sponsoring broad strategic research from the King's College War Studies Department. What you find is, if all those budgets are being cut, having the Haldane principle protecting the only remaining budget in town proves more and more frustrating for your colleagues. And what they want is to raid the surviving science. But they think, why on earth is our science budget also driven, protected by this Haldane principle? Why can't we use it to solve all these practical problems? Don't scientists want to solve these practical problems as well? And the truth is that's what the departmental budgets were supposed to do. And you endlessly therefore face the dilemma. Do you sacrifice some of the surviving science budget, or do you protect the Haldane principled science budget and argue back to the departments, if that's what you want, you've got to fund it yourselves? That's how Whitehall works. So that was the first tension. The second tension I referred to was kind of where the money goes. And with this is our system of funding universities through HEFCE and also through the Research Councils is an unusual model, but I think it has a logic, and here I tried very briefly to summarise the logic of it. I think of HEFCE grants to universities as compensation for not having endowments. It's to give them a pot of money that the individual universities, can use to fund the research that the university chooses to research. Now, of course, initially, HEFCE did not publish its findings on research quality, which had the effect of dampening down competition, but maximising the discretion of the Vice-Chancellor and University management. In principle, it remains the case that university Vice-Chancellors have discretion with their teams about how this money is to be spent. I would guess the more it becomes clear who is kind of earning the money through their research performance, that creates a greater presumption that it should go back to them. But in principle, there is a decision taken within the university. Separately, you have the research councils engaging in programme funding for projects, which is, instead of saying, here's an institution, we trust you to get on with it, it's we're paying you £500,000, £10 million to deliver research project X. And that mix, these two forms of funding, by far the bulk of the classic science budget, have ended up, I think, as being one of the secrets of how our science budget has proved to be delivered so much excellent research at relatively low levels of funding. Let me now turn to the third issue, which is, okay, you've got this science budget, you've sadly lost your departmental R&D, but you've got your science budget, and you've got your dual funding streams. Where is this research to happen? Is it to happen on university campuses, or is it to happen in public sector research establishments? And the PSREs are one of the most frustrating, and I think this is a crucial part of the story of British science, because through large parts of the 20th century we had very significant networks of public sector research establishments, and they were often created in times of war. First World War saw them, Second World War. Research associations were created after Second World War to carry on driving these things. And they have a range of functions, and I'm giving some examples here of these are institutions that survive. BGS is a British Geological Survey. If you want to see data, if you want to see a data resource in its most brutally physical form, at BGS they have 10,000 tons of core samples. So, because for most of the last century, any person doing any drilling on the UK landmass or offshore was obliged to deposit a core sample with the British Geological Survey. So that is essentially storage of data for uses that now it's being used to analyse where there's the best potential for fracking, which when people might have been drilling to see if there was gold in the Pennines in 1950 would not have occurred to them. But it's got the classic features of a long-term resource where it has uses that nobody could imagine at the time when it was initially being collected. But it's a kind of copyright library for geologists and incredibly valuable. That's one function, and there are other research institutes. There's a second function which is providing that measurement and standards function, which is what the National Physical Laboratory out in Teddington does. And again, I always thought one of the many advantages of being at the cutting edge of science is you can have an influence internationally in shaping standards and measurement. And this can have it, in turn, have significant economic benefits. And I give you an example of a conversation I was having with someone from NPL earlier this month. Photovoltaic cells and measuring their efficiency. The efficiency of photovoltaic cells, the measurement that is you stick them under a very bright light at a temperature of about 25 degrees centigrade and assess their efficiency in those circumstances. This is an efficiency measure designed for people developing photovoltaic cells for sunny, hot climates. It is not a measure that performs very well for people trying to develop photovoltaic cells for diffuse, lower intensity light of the sort we have in Northern Europe. If you wanted to promote the development of photovoltaic cells in the UK or Germany that met our requirements, instead of you would want to have a standard that captured what they were trying to do, rather than making them just look inferior to ones designed that used to stick in the Sahara Desert or the south coast of Spain. That's the kind of area where it's hard for one business or economic agent to do it, but there's a legitimate role for government in promoting and developing those type of trusted standards, and it's what the NPL was set up to do. And then thirdly, with Venki here, we have to mention just great research institutes doing research, and the Laboratory of Molecular Biology at Cambridge is one of the world's great post-war research centres, and it is not part of Cambridge University, has close links to it. It is a Medical Research Council institute. So those are the type of things that our research establishments do. Sustaining them and supporting them is incredibly hard work. They are fundamentally trying to operate in a hostile environment. And the problems they encounter are manifold. First of all, as they are part of the public sector, they are subject to a whole host of public sector rules. Rules on everything from the pay they can do, the pay they can deliver their staff, through to how they should procure projects, to how they should, what information they should put on websites. They are automatically part of the public sector. And it may be, and this is an example I had at a meeting at the LNB, it may be that procurement rules designed for hospitals purchasing toilet paper are not the best procurement rules when the LNB is trying to work with innovative developers to create new instruments for it to do cutting-edge research. But Cabinet Office rules apply. And I remember discussions with the Chancellor who completely got the point that this was really not, they were not supposed to apply in this way. It made no sense, and the aim was that the our leading art galleries and national museums and our PSRE should have some exemption from it. Secondly, there is no overall custodian of our PSREs. They are not responsibility of the Science Minister, particularly whichever department. Many Whitehall departments happen to have a few, and if money is tight, or there hasn't been a crisis in that area during the working time of the minister in charge of the department, I think, well, do we really need that? Do we really need something? Foot and mouth? We haven't had foot and mouth for ages. We don't really need to keep a capacity for foot and mouth, do we? So you find departments have quite a short-term approach. These are things which you may discover why you really need them in a crisis, but funding them year by year is tough. Privatisation, and I was involved in privatisation in the 1980s and continue to think that we transformed the performance of some of those nationalised industries, but I do not recall a single meeting in the Treasury when the following issue was raised. These nationalised industries were sponsoring very large R&D functions and were funding significant R&D. It was the kind of nationalised industry equivalent of the Bell Labs. When we privatise them, what will happen to the labs? What we ended up doing is creating a regulatory regime which was so preoccupied with the dangers of what we in the Treasury called gold plating, excess investment when really prices should be held down, that I had conversations during my time with privatised utilities that said we would love to pay some money to fund this research, but we wouldn't get it past the regulator. The regulator will say this is excess investment, you don't need to do it, our aim is to hold down the prices. So we've shifted from a nationalised industry model which actually supported R&D centres to a regulatory regime for privatised industries which actually keeps them out of R&D if at all possible. And then more widely, a kind of philosophical shift in Whitehall that everything has to be up for a competitive bid every few years. So all of these institutions are endlessly being reviewed. It's very hard to say this is just a long-term strategic capacity. We've had it for a century. It'd be really handy if we could just keep on having it, please. So my experience of these type of issues led me to ask Manchester University to do a review of how PSRs were being maintained across Whitehall. And we managed, the furthest I could do, was that we got departments all to sign up to a set of guidelines about what they needed to do before they closed or privatised a PSRE. But Britain has ended up with a relatively weak network of PSREs, and the safest place for a PSRE to go is onto a university campus, because universities are in the private sector. Universities are not in the public sector. So you exit the public sector, you're no longer subject to all these controls. You can find a friendly vice-chancellor, you'll bring to him some high-ref performing academics. What could be better than that? And so they head off onto university campuses. And it's great for a few years. And then the vice-chancellor changes. Or they don't do quite so well in one of the refs. And they say, well, we've got to focus on what we're best at. Let's close down that research function. I can't remember why we ended up with it. We were presumably helping out the department when they had a difficulty or something. So life on a university campus is not as secure as being a sustained long-term PSRE would be. And it's not always a reliable environment for these. Some universities are excellent custodians, others have not proved to be so. So we have not, and I regard this as a public policy failure, and I'm as culpable as anyone else. Britain in the last 30 years has not provided an environment in which PSREs can thrive and prosper. So we have ended up, and what a contrast with Germany. where, it's a fascinating and difficult history which there isn't time, Germany having been the place where the research-intensive university first emerged, by the middle of the 20th century, had instead shifted its research effort much more onto its network of research institutes, and it's got several networks, with Max Planck making fantastic advances in the theoretical sciences, through to Fraunhofer's, which are the most applied R&D with close links to business. And these are not part of higher education, so they do not count in any competitive rankings. So it looks, if you try to assess a nation's research performance by how its research universities are doing, Germany looks like a modest performer compared with the UK. But that's because we've got all our eggs in the university basket. They have a lot of their research in a non-university location. What we have done is we have put our research into higher education to the exclusion of most other options. And this is the result. This is the proportion of R&D funded and happening inside universities compared with gross R&D, which includes across all the private sector instead. This includes commercial spending and R&D as well. And you can see the UK is on a significantly, there we are, 26%, pretty high, significantly higher. The US has got this fantastic strength that they can both have a large range of research-intensive universities, and also all their big departments sponsor large departmental R&D facilities on the Lawrence and Livermores and the Argonnes and everything. Germany is, as you can see, lower on higher education. Their provincial governments can pay for research on the university campuses, and businesses do. That's why there is still that. And this high proportion reflects, let's look at those same figures from a different dimension. Let's just take total spend on GDP, which is GDP on research. And what you can see is we've put all our eggs in this HE basket, with the effect that our HE R&D spend is broadly comparable as a percentage of GDP to competitor countries. And so what we do on research, what we get for that is indeed, and this is why we mustn't beat up on ourselves, what we get for that relatively small part of R&D from our universities is undoubtedly matches, if not superior, to what other countries get for a broadly similar spend. But that is out of, that 0.44 is out of a total of 1.7 of GDP, which is significantly lower than the other countries. We're lower on business sector GDP. But look at this. This is the departmental R&D. This is buying other stuff for applied use. For that, we are running at a third of what France, Germany, and the US are doing. That is the missing bit of public spend on R&D. So we've ended up with a very unusual distribution, relative weighting, and we've essentially, and oddly enough, it's hard to find any strategic decision we should go down this route. But what we've essentially decided to do is we haven't got money to do both. We will go for a competitive matching strategy on HE and sacrifice the other types of R&D with a limited public sector budget. That is essentially the strategy of successive British governments. Now, I think this analysis of what we're doing helps to explain some of the puzzles that we always worry about. And that is, okay, we're doing all this great research, and on some measures we're good at innovation, and I know Venki will want to intervene on this. In terms of commercialization, and in terms of commercial spend on R&D, and the creation of new commercial products, we're not brilliant performers. What's going on? Why is this supposed surge in R&D performance not being reflected downstream? Well, I think we're beginning to see from this analysis the explanation to that puzzle. First of all, businesses know and are able to deal with their Fraunhofer institutes and their research institutes in Germany and the US. They don't find it always so easy to deal with universities, and they don't know who to phone, and they don't always know how to access a university. So we have got a relatively weak network of research establishments that businesses are familiar with, and are strong in university campus research in a more academic context, which is why I wanted to create something more like the Fraunhofers, and both Peter Mandelson had commissioned Hermann Hauser to do a report. George Oswald and I, in opposition, commissioned James Dyson to do a report on this, and both of them said, learn from the German Fraunhofers and the catapult centres, an attempt to try to strengthen this network of intermediate institutions with some business involvement. Secondly, if you're in this university environment, how do you win? And you've got highly competitive funding for research. How do you get up the ref if you're a university vice-chancellor? How do you get promoted if you're an individual university academic? By excellent articles in peer-reviewed journals. That is the competitive model which determines performance for the vast bulk of our R&D spend. And we are producing greyhounds of global quality. That's what you want. We have got a system that's perfectly tuned for doing it. It isn't very well tuned for achieving other objectives, because this is what we're focusing on. And you can see it in the criteria for winning funding as well, which is always innovative, cutting-edge research. I always thought, thinking of my background and interest in public policy and social policy, you know, if you were going to, as a minister, it would be quite helpful to have a good, reliable evaluation of the effectiveness of welfare to work programs in Scotland. Kind of thing that just helps you do policy better. Needn't have flashy innovations in the use of statistics or a brilliant discovery of a new data set. Just be good to know what's working, what doesn't work in Scotland. That isn't how you get promotion as a professor, and it's not necessarily going to get you as high ranking in the ref. Using an innovative statistical technique on a hitherto unknown set of data to reach some challenging conclusion about how an R&D project worked in a welfare to work program with a large data set attached to it, Roosevelt's New Deal or something, that was much more sexy as an academic subject, but it might not be what we need. And it's perfectly reasonable for people within the incentive structure we've created to focus on those type of projects, but because you don't have departmental R&D, and because you don't have this wider network, it's what tends to happen. And then spin-outs. What we've tried to do in response to this concern, and it goes back to the report from the excellent Richard Lambert, is ask universities to count their spin-outs. And it's good to have university spin-outs, but spin-outs are not the be-all and end-all of the relationship with business on innovation. And you can have too many spin-outs. You can spin out companies too soon, when they should really stay at the lab for longer. And you can have, and we're used to the idea of kind of ancient dinosaur industries staggering through, but you can also have small companies that have barely got the funding to keep their IP up to date, that aren't viable and commercial and have been pushed out. We've got lots of premature babies that have been pushed out into a tough environment too soon. And responding to this challenge of doing better in innovation by saying you must do more spin-outs has, I think, has had the effect of promoting an excessive focus on only one form in which you can have business-university interaction. So I conclude that what we have got as the British model of the science after this 100 years is it scores very highly on autonomy, which, and that's understandable. It's very important to have that principle for the science budget. It scores low on application, because we haven't got much money we spent on that, and we haven't got many criteria that reward that. It scores very highly on the international rankings for university performance, but it doesn't particularly deliver innovation. And I think when we understand the structure and the decisions that have been taken in the past 100 years, we can understand why we have ended up with a science system that works like that. I was going to go on to talk about technology, but I'm not. I'm instead going to invite, and I'm delighted to hear, Venkatraman Ramakrishnan to offer his comments on my talk. Thank you very much indeed.
So, thank you very much for asking me to respond. That was a wonderful speech, and I have to say, David was kind enough to give me a text of his of a chapter on which the speech is based, and I found it so interesting that I asked him for permission to send it to people who are actually developing a university in India, where they want to combine education with research, because it goes deep into the history of, as you've heard, of how universities got into research and how the research environment developed. So it's really a great tour of the last many hundred years and a tour de force as well. So I was asked to respond, and I'm going to respond a little bit directly, but I'd also like to talk a bit about where we are today and where do we go, what are some of the issues that face us. And David mentioned the distinction between PSREs and universities. And one of the things is that they do have different strengths. So I should admit that I came here because of the strength of the PSREs. That is why I left a university environment in the US, which is not so different from the modern university environment in Britain, except that they don't have this funding stream from the government. And so they don't have a dual funding stream from the government, but they have it indirectly by siphoning off overhead from grants. So effectively, they do have it, but they just don't have it in a direct form. So why did I come to a PSRE, which is the LMB in Cambridge? Well, first of all, the LMB itself is a sort of special place. But what makes it a special place is the ability to concentrate on long-term difficult problems in a focused way. And that's because of the stability of the funding that it gets as a PSRE, as opposed to grant-based funding that universities get for directed research. And so it allows them to have a longer-term approach. It allows them to build a kind of infrastructure that is purpose-built for the kind of research that they're doing. And David mentioned the NPL. That's another example. In the US, the counterpart is NIST, which is the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And they can also focus on these things by building the appropriate infrastructure. At the same time, universities have their own advantages. And one of them is that universities bring together a wide array of disciplines. You can have theoretical physicists and mathematicians with geneticists and plant scientists, and all on the same campus. And this can lead to cross-fertilization. The other thing about it is that it trains future generations. So it involves students, often from a very early stage, even as undergraduates, in cutting-edge research. And so it essentially is responsible for training future generations of scientists. So we need to consider that as an advantage. And the fact that you have a constant turnover of people in the form of students, as well as different disciplines all coming together on the same campus, means that you generate a diversity of ideas. One of the problems that research institutes have is how to sustain that originality. And to me, it's still astonishing that the LMB, after several generations, is still sustaining originality, because often there's a danger that they'll start thinking the same way and become ossified. And so that's a problem. So in the debate that we now have about PSREs versus universities, we need to consider the advantage, and especially, as David pointed out, the number of PSREs is declining. When I came, there was the NIMR in Mill Hill, which was a sort of sister institution to the LMB. Well, NIMR no longer exists. It's now been absorbed in a privatized Crick Institute. And the LMB, for a while, there was a debate about whether we should also become private and perhaps join Cambridge University. Well, Cambridge University, I think, wasn't too enthusiastic about absorbing the LMB. It would have been a bit like a python trying to swallow an elephant, or so, perhaps. It would have upset the sort of balance of sciences being of the kind of research being done in Cambridge, because we're heavily life sciences. So, and we have, at the same time, had no desire to leave the MRC, because we felt that part of what made us do what we did well was that stable relationship with the MRC. And so we're one of the few very large research institutes left in that way. So the other thing that David alluded to is the business of research and entrepreneurship. And he had a somewhat pessimistic slide at the end, which said that we're very good at research, but very poor at entrepreneurship. And I would say we're actually pretty good at some entrepreneurship, but we're not able to somehow grow them. So what is the evidence that we're actually good at innovation? We're second in the Global Innovation Index, second only to Switzerland. And we're second in, David pointed out that we're very good at research, and that's true. We're second in the world in the quality of our research. But we're also second in innovation, as measured by the Global Innovation Index. And we're fourth in the world in university-industry collaboration on R&D. So these are all good signs that the research we do is actually making it out into the sort of commercial sphere. And our spin-out rate, now this came as a surprise to me when I found out about it, that our spin-out rate is actually comparable to the best in the world. I had always thought of the US and Israel as particularly good at generating startups from research. And it turns out that we're actually as good per capita as these countries are. So where are some of the problems? Well, where it lags behind is in the growth phase. Now, David pointed out that one problem may be that we're putting out too many spin-outs, and so many of them are failing and not growing. Well, I'm not sure this is the case, and I don't know if it is a case or not. And actually what we need is some data on what is our failure rate compared to the failure rate in the US or the failure rate in Germany or China, etc., for startups. It'd be interesting to know whether, in fact, our failure rate is worse, which is what we would expect if we're putting out too many spin-outs. But there are definite problems with spin-outs, and that is that once they reach a certain level, and I've come across this because I'm also a fellow of Trinity College, and we have these dinners with Science Park startups, many of which were helped by Trinity. And nearly all of them say that once they reach a certain stage, they have to go to the US for financing. And it is true that perhaps the US is the global capital market and it's unavoidable, but on the other hand, London's a great financial center, and there's no reason in principle why that should be a problem in the UK. The other problem is the skills gap. That when they grow, they need large numbers of skilled workers, but they also need skilled leadership. They need sufficient number of leaders who know how to manage growth. And unless you have that sort of ecosystem, you won't have those kinds of leaders, those kind of CEOs and COOs and CSOs that help a company make that transition. So those are some of the problems in innovation, in translating innovation. And I'll give you just two very recent examples. So in Cambridge, someone I know well was involved in a technology to very rapidly sequence DNA. And this has led to a revolution, the next-gen sequencing. And the company they formed was Solexa, which was, based in Cambridge. But Solexa eventually, had to rely on US capital, and then eventually sold out to Innova, which is now, US-based. So there's an example where, a Cambridge invention had to essentially be sold out. Similar thing has happened with, antibody technology, although in that case, one of the companies, MedImmune, which was based in the US, was ultimately bought by AstraZeneca, and so really it sort of came back by accident to the UK. But the point still remains. And then recently we've heard about, the computer that beat the world Go champion made all the headlines. And you know, DeepMind was a UK company, but if you read the New York Times, you don't realize that it was a UK invention that beat the Go champion. In the New York Times, it was a Google company, you know, that led that. So there again is a case where a very successful company couldn't scale up, you know, and eventually ended up being bought by Google. And you know, I heard at a Labs to Riches dinner that we had at the Royal Society that if you're an IT company, the chances are, if you're successful, you'll be bought by about one of four or five companies. You know, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, you know, one of these companies. So there again, we have an issue. So people go, they start up, and they often will end up going to the US. This kind of mobility is part of science. And I want to just talk about science as an international endeavor. So not only, it's fine for British innovators to end up in the US, as long as we can attract them, innovators here as well. I'm exactly that sort of transplant. At the LMB, we have several such transplants. In fact, I'm happy to say that just today, one such transplant colleague of mine, also from the US, was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. So if you look at our research establishment, about a quarter of our academic staff in our universities and research institutes are actually came here as foreign nationals. And that's representative of a dynamic country. If you look at the US, about 20 to 30% of the National Academy of Sciences consist of people who are not born in the US. 40% of living British Nobel Prize winners were born overseas. And science infrastructure also involves international collaboration. Now, what does this have to do with policy? Well, it does have to do with the kind of policy we have towards immigration of skilled labor, towards residency requirements, all of those things. And it does impinge on the EU debate that's going on as well. Now, how do we fund research in the future? I don't want to say too much about it, but I want to end by pointing out that there is a kind of change in the air about how research is going to be funded. We've had a number of research councils which fund different areas of research. There is now a move to consider how they should be reorganized and how they should be integrated, etc. And so there's this change in the air, and there's quite a bit of concern in the air, because any change naturally brings concern. Now, this sort of change is an opportunity to strengthen the system, because what we really want is the most bang for our buck. We don't want reorganization for reorganization's sake, or to, you know, change the numbers of some items in some organizational chart. The real goal is to make research more efficient, to be more dynamic, more responsive, more adaptable, all of these things. That's the goal. And our focus should be on how we go about getting that goal. And so my one sort of plea is that when government is considering these large changes, it's really a good idea to engage deeply with the research community, because that is the best way to get feedback, that is the best way to understand what the concerns are so they can be addressed. And it's also a way to make sure that the proposals that come forward will be robust and will stand the test of time in many other ways. So that I'll close there. Thank you very much.
Okay, my friends, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Can I have your name and any affiliation, and can you wait for the microphones? Who's first, please? Yes, please.
David Walker, Guardian Public. David, is a further illustration of the British model that you've characterised, the apparent weakness of the mobilisation of evidence for policy. Your example of the evaluation of welfare for work, if you were still in Whitehall, you would tend to turn to a non-academic institution, IFS, NISR, RAND Institute, rather than a university. Is that illustrative of the point you were making?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think it would be hard to say the IFS was a sort of an inferior way of analysing data. Of course, the IFS is an example of the phenomenon I was describing, because I think the IFS has now been embraced by UCL. It's headed into a university environment, and I can imagine exactly the considerations that led them to do it. I think that there were real efforts, and Jeremy Hayward is serious about this, to improve the quality of evidence use in Whitehall. But often the evidence, there's a long journey from evidence to policy. Policy, you can rarely read it off on a kind of graph, so that's the right thing to do. There's a whole series of policy trade-offs and normative judgments. I think that's probably more the problem in politics. I think we are a bit light there on departments spending money directly on evaluation of their policies. That's where, because of the departmental R&D budgets being so limited.
Thank you. Down the front here, please.
Thank you. Graham Reid from UCL. First of all, thanks very much to David for such a super lecture. Much of it was about the relationship between government and science. So if you were to gauge the effectiveness of government-science communications over 100 years, what would the shape of the graph be?
I think that it was clear there are periods such as wartime when you see surges of scientists into Whitehall, and that then leaves a set of friendships and social connections that carry on for years, sometimes decades afterwards. And then other moments like Harold Wilson bringing in a lot of scientists like Blackett in his time. I would say now we have the advantage of the structure of chief science advisors in each department, which is a great asset, and we've now, just about every department has got one, and I think the chief scientist, now Mark Walport, does an excellent job of ensuring the science voice is heard. I think where it goes back to David's point, I still think it could be closer on the policy side, but there are faults on both sides. I mean, you get bits of research which are incredibly sophisticated analyses of data, and then, in an almost cavalier way, the last two paragraphs bring out what they think might be the policy implications. And I think there's a lot of scientists and researchers for whom the shift from positive to normative is just so scary that they don't really want to get into it. And in fact, what we try to do at the Policy Institute, and Jonathan Grant is here, is give academics a bit more confidence that they should analyse policy options with the same kind of rigour as they apply to the data.
Thank you. Yep.
Daniel Crammon from King's. So I thought it was a really interesting lecture. One of the more interesting aspects that we didn't get a chance to touch on is obviously one of the implications of the Nurse Review is potentially the integration of Innovate UK into the Research UK structure. And I think that brings additional dynamics of change in terms of that balance between fundamental research, applied research, and what you might call on the quadrant, the pure Edison R&D. And I'd just be interested in whether you see what the opportunities and the dilemmas are for universities as part of that mix. For, at the moment, the EPSRC, MRC have a range of applied research into, commercialisation options and programs with industry, but with putting Innovate UK in the mix, that's again an interesting opportunity, but could it shift the nature of what goes on in universities in the next 15, 20 years in unexpected ways?
Yes, I think
I mean, it could work, and let's hope it does. Obviously, the issue is that Innovate UK has a wider range of responsibilities than transmitting university research out into the wider economic world. I mean, that's an important and valuable thing to do, but it's not its sole function. It also tries to promote innovation in other ways that may not be dependent on original research. So it's important that even if it's put in a more academic research environment, it's not pulled by that. There isn't a sort of gravitational pull away from those other ways of promoting innovation. In, say, I think what Venki was saying was quite right about the next stage of growth, you know, all the Sherry Kutu agenda, and growing already successful companies that are just too small and helping them and advising them on how to grow is an important thing it does, and it's not particularly related to the research community. So that'll be the challenge. But there's no right place for putting things, but that'll be the challenge. From
there. Matt Roster, Global Government Forum. How effective do you think this government's sort of science and R&D policy is compared to some of our overseas countries? And have you seen things overseas that you think we could really learn from?
Well, and it's not specifically this government, what we have achieved, especially since the emergence of the REF and the RAE before it, for a relatively modest amount of money, we get an extraordinary range of high-quality academic research. And that for a 4.7 billion science budget, you get the extraordinary citation rate we do is quite extraordinary, and it's, of course, above all the achievement of the scientists and researchers, but it tells us there's something right about the policy framework. As I say, that's the thoroughbred. We've created this thoroughbred. It's not a cart horse. And when you look at the way in which Fraunhofer Institutes work in Germany, they are cart horses that help year in, year out, big swathes of German industry innovate, apply new technologies, keep the BMWs up to speed, now trying to ensure that in the race for the driverless car, Google doesn't win. It doesn't become a computer with four wheels around the corners, it becomes a car that's very sophisticated. That's the kind of technical challenge they can set themselves and use public and private money to meet. We're just not organised like that. Now, Britain isn't Germany, and we never will be completely organised like that. But I think as I said, and that was why we did catapults, we have thinned out too much the network of intermediate institutions that could help businesses in particular sectors or with particular technologies.
Thank you. Anthony Finkelstein, the Alan Turing Institute. So I'm quite interested in the question of FEC and the chipping away that we've seen in FEC, which has resulted in a change in the way that universities are funding research, and has tied together education and research, and particularly high-fee overseas students, and our research economy. And I'm quite interested in your comments about what effects that might have, and indeed whether or not an institute structure is possible when the key economic driver is in fact education rather than research per se.
Well, Venki might want to comment on this. I mean, what you are accurately reflecting is a concern you do hear from some of our most research-intensive universities, who, to put it more crudely than you put it, say kind of, we can't operate everything at marginal cost. Somewhere we need to cover our fixed costs, and which is the bit of the budget that's going to help us with our fixed costs. Everything seems to run as a loss. So I understand the pressure, and indeed overseas students, that's one of the reasons why overseas students have become so important. They're one of the sources of revenues that can then be used for meet full costs. And of course research councils do try to help out on that. But it is indeed a very important challenge. Now, the research councils can, in theory, fund a research institute at full cost to operate at full cost. The pressure they then face is, you know, let's use some purely illustrative figures. You've got a £500 million budget. You're putting 75 million a year into this research institute. Is that really how the nation should be spending 15% of its total public effort in this area? And shouldn't you turn the kaleidoscope? Shouldn't you re-roll the dice? Why do these people have a right to carry on with their core funding when I'm busy bidding for programme funding year after year? Now, I think there is a need for core funding, but when budgets are constrained, it's an intense pressure on research councils. I don't know what you think.
Well, it's true, and you know, as someone who works at an MRC lab, I mean, we're under constant pressure to justify why the MRC should fund us, you know, by the core funding model with full economic cost, when, you know, our colleagues in universities have to, you know, bid every every few years for grants, and then have to, you know, with no guarantee that they'll continue to be funded. I can point out the difference with the US. So here you do have this dual funding stream, and in theory that was supposed to take care of the problem. That is, you know, the direct funding stream to the university was supposed to help, you know, infrastructure, building labs, etc. And then the grant funding scheme would fund individual projects, and so everything would be fine. But, you know, when budgets decline and there's attrition, then you start running into problems. In the US, there never was this direct funding stream, but they indirectly tapped it by charging overheads. Sometimes the overhead would be 100%. You know, that means if you applied for a $100,000 grant, then, you know, the university would claim another $100,000. So the funding agency would have to cough up $200,000 in order to fund this $100,000. It was, you know, so that was one extreme. But then they would siphon off this money, and that money would then go for seed grants and for buildings and hiring new faculty and all sorts of things to keep that up. But that model is very unstable because, you know, it was great during when, I met Harold Varmus last week, but when he was director of NIH, he doubled the NIH budget over a period of 5 years, which was quite a rapid expansion. And during that time, all the universities felt there was this big gravy train from the NIH, you know, that they could just build new buildings and hire all sorts of people and so on. And it came to a crashing halt. And then they found themselves overstretched. They couldn't support the, you know, people that they'd hired. They couldn't even, you know, keep the buildings going in some cases. So that's a very sort of roller coaster model. And the better universities in the US have a third leg, which is they rely heavily on private benefactors. And in the US, private benefactors funding science is a big, you know, operation. And perhaps, you know, we in Britain need to, you know, try and develop that more, you know, getting more private benefactors into endowing, you know, universities for science.
Thank you. A very last question at the back over there. Oh, okay. If they're quick, just there.
Try and make it quick. Alan Evans, Chief Executive of the British Academy. I could ask a question about the value of research into social sciences and humanities, but I'll take that as led. What I want to ask about was the graph that David put up about the share of research funding taken by each of the research councils. What is actually striking over the last 40 years? Actually, the share between the different research councils hasn't changed that much. And is that just because we got it right over the last 40 years, or more likely that various political pressures and others have meant that no politician has been willing to make a shift in the split between the various? What could government do if it really wanted to make a strategic shift in terms of the balance of funding into different parts of the research environment?
I mean, I think, well, the Ashley Sweetman's chart did show, I think, some variation, but overall, you're right, there's not been a massive shift. I would say there are three explanations. Partly, for most of the time, other than some years when public spending was surging under Labour, for most of the time, we've been talking about a cash-constrained system. So increasing a budget for one looks a lot like a zero-sum game where someone else loses out. Secondly, as I said, there is a legitimate, you can argue there's a legitimate strategy here of a full-service science base. And we have not had to take a really tough decision to move out of some areas. We are still holding on just about to a full disciplined science base, which is an amazing achievement for a West European country. And I would say, thirdly, a point I didn't make in my speech, the question is what happens behind the facade. If the research councils are doing the same kind of subjects in the same kind of ways and have missed out on major intellectual advances, we've got a problem. If the research councils are capable of innovating, being ahead of the curve in research and working together when new disciplines emerge that straddle the boundaries of research councils, then this fixed funding flow is less of an issue. So I think you have to look behind that to say, are the research councils a kind of dead hand holding back intellectual innovation, or have they used their money to promote it? I think on balance, they have been able to use their money to drive innovation. But there are people in different disciplines who are expert on those disciplines who will have their own views about what I say. And Venki's views will be much more authoritative than mine.
So, this precise point was brought out and was mentioned in the Nurse Review as an argument for having a more integrated structure. And the idea was that, well, if these separate research councils, the relative allocations hadn't changed in decades. If you look at it, you can see that the different research councils encompass within themselves quite broad disciplines. The Medical Research Council, for instance, that I'm familiar with, encompasses all of biomedical science, spanning everything from molecular biology to protein structure to clinical work, etc. And so what you have to ask is, is the broad allocation between physical sciences, engineering, and biological sciences and medical research, is that something that we must expect to change over the years? And maybe if the disciplines are broad enough, and if we want to maintain a broad portfolio, maybe that won't change very much. The question you have to ask is the allocation changing within the research councils? Is the Medical Research Council supporting the same kind of research today as it did 50 years ago? Are the allocations in the sub-disciplines remaining the same? And I would bet that's not the case, that we're doing quite different kinds of research now than we were before.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, just here, please. Sorry, Adam. Just one in the middle, just there. There we go.
Hi, Becky Hill from Research Fortnight magazine. You spoke about the tension between the core science budget and departmental R&D, but you also said that when you started, you had Graham on your door saying, sign up to the Haldane Principle. And obviously there's a conflict in that because the Haldane Principle protects the core. How do you think in 50 years, if someone gives another talk like this, we'll be talking about the Haldane Principle in the past tense?
I hope not. No, I think that when it comes to the decision about specific scientific research projects, and even what Venki has just been talking about, the balance of funding within the MRC because of intellectual innovations in life sciences, it would be absurd to have ministers trying to second-guess the judgments of scientists on that. And I wouldn't wish to get into that position. I think it's a great... And you'd be surprised. And that is incredibly precious, actually. We may think it's obvious, but there are many other countries where, even advanced Western countries, where we don't have that principle. What is legitimate is for... But there are, and I didn't get into this, there are lots of things which are legitimately the matters of public policy. They're clearly departmental R&D spend. Minister will have a sense of priorities. There's massive arguments about the badger cull. I need some research, please, and quickly on badgers and bovine TB. That's a public policy decision that's part of a democratically elected minister's job. There's capital, big capital projects. There's international subscriptions. And there's the balance between the research councils. That's why this power, although it's not been exercised, part of the answer to Alan is it does exist. It's always been accepted, it's possible for the science minister to say, I think, who cares about social science? I see Jane Elliott over there. It's a shocking thought, I know. It's a shocking thought. But, you know, we can't afford social science. Who wants it? Or, conversely, this is a country that's changing. Countries that change need a lot of social science going on. I think we're underweight on social science. That is a legitimate decision for a minister to take with expert advice. And it is true, and I think this is where some of what Paul says is correct. When you look at the history of the last 50 years, usually there was a more explicit advisory board group that was there to help a minister with that kind of decision. And I think it's true to say that when that came up in the CSR, I think Adrian Smith took some soundings, you know, went and had a whiskey with the president of the Royal Society, or a dry sherry or something, and said, and he took some, and he just came back and said to me, I think, you know, there is not a great move, that this needs to be rebalanced, and my political judgment, it should be rebalanced. If you did want to do a big rebalancing, you would have needed something more sophisticated and transparent than that. And that is, and I can see, and you could argue it's what the Council of Science and Technology should do. Someone should have that kind of responsibility. The power lies with the minister.
Well, that brings us to an end. The next Strand Group will take place in a fortnight's time, when we'll have the Ambassador of Ireland to the UK, Daniel Mulhall, who's going to talk about the UK, Ireland and Europe, a productive partnership. I don't know whether there's a question mark at the end of that one. Will you please join us for a drink upstairs in chapters? Do forgive me for just running a little bit over time, because there were plenty of questions from the audience, and they were coming thick and fast late on. Would you therefore join me in thanking, first of all, Sir Venki and Lord Willetts. We're very proud to have you at King's. Thank you.
It's a very good question, which I